A child cried alone at the train station, until a lonely widow stopped to listen. The autumn rain drummed steadily against the windows of Chicago's Union Station, turning the bustling terminal into a symphony of echoing footsteps, muffled conversations, and the distant whistle of departing trains. Margaret Maggie O'Brien pulled her wool coat tighter around her shoulders as she navigated through the crowd, her worn leather suitcase in hand. At 62 years old, Maggie had made this journey countless times over the past 3 years, the monthly trip from her empty house in the suburbs to downtown Chicago, where she would spend hours walking the city streets, browsing shops she couldn't afford, and sitting in cafes nursing a single cup of coffee for as long as politeness allowed. Anything to avoid the suffocating silence of the house she'd once shared with her husband Patrick. Today's trip had been no different from the others. She'd wandered State Street, looked at Christmas decorations that seemed to mock her loneliness, and finally found herself back at Union Station as the November sky darkened into evening. The train back to Elmhurst wouldn't leave for another hour, but Maggie was in no hurry to return to her empty home. She was settling onto a bench with the novel she'd been carrying for weeks, the same book she started but never seemed to finish when she heard it. A soft, heartbroken sobbing that seemed to cut through all the noise of the station like a knife through silk. Maggie looked around, trying to locate the source of the crying. Most of the other travelers were too absorbed in their own journeys to notice, rushing past with their heads down and their minds on their destinations. But Maggie had spent enough time in grief to recognize its sound, and this was different from the usual tears of travelers saying goodbye or dealing with delayed trains. This was the sound of true despair. She found him in a corner near the information booth, a small boy who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, huddled on a bench with his face buried in his hands. His clothes were clean but wrinkled, as if he'd been wearing them for longer than intended. And beside him sat a small canvas bag that looked like it contained everything he owned in the world. Maggie approached slowly, the way she might approach a wounded animal. "Sweetheart, are you all right?" The boy looked up, revealing a face streaked with tears and eyes that were far too old for his young features. He had sandy brown hair that needed cutting and a smattering of freckles across his nose. When he saw Maggie, his first instinct was to wipe his face quickly and straighten up, as if he'd been caught doing something wrong. "I'm fine," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Maggie sat down on the bench beside him, leaving enough space so he wouldn't feel trapped. "I'm Maggie. What's your name?" The boy hesitated, looking around the station as if checking to see if anyone was watching them. "Danny," he said finally. "That's a good name," Maggie said gently. "Are you traveling alone?" "Danny." The boy's lower lip trembled, and for a moment, Maggie thought he was going to start crying again. Instead, he nodded once, quickly. "Where are you going?" "I don't know," Danny admitted, his voice breaking on the words. "I'm supposed to go to my aunt's house, but I lost the paper with her address. I don't remember the name of the town, and I don't have any more money for tickets." Maggie felt her heart clench with familiar pain. 3 years ago, she'd been the one feeling lost and alone, overwhelmed by a world that suddenly seemed too big and complicated to navigate without Patrick by her side. "When did you last eat?" she asked. Danny's stomach answered for him, growling loudly enough that he blushed. "This morning, I think. Maybe yesterday morning. The days are getting mixed up." Without hesitation, Maggie stood up. "Come on then. Let's get you some food, and you can tell me how you ended up here." Danny looked at her with suspicion and hope warring in his expression. "I don't have any money." "That's all right," Maggie said. "I do." As they walked toward the station's small cafe, Danny clutching his bag and staying close to Maggie's side, she found herself wondering what had brought this child to be alone in one of the busiest train stations in the country. But more than that, she found herself feeling something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. The sense that she was needed, that her presence in the world might actually matter to someone. "Ma'am," Danny said as they reached the cafe counter. "Why are you helping me?" Maggie looked down at him, seeing something of her own loneliness reflected in his young face. "Because everyone deserves to have someone stop and listen when they're crying," she said simply. As they ordered food, a sandwich and soup for Danny, coffee for herself, Maggie realized that for the first time since Patrick's death, she wasn't thinking about her own grief. Instead, she was focused entirely on this lost little boy who'd somehow found his way into her path. The train to Elmhurst would leave in 45 minutes, but suddenly going home to her empty house seemed like the least important thing in the world. The cafe was nearly empty except for a few tired travelers nursing coffee and waiting for late trains. Maggie watched as Danny attacked his sandwich with the desperate hunger of someone who hadn't eaten properly in days. She waited until he'd taken the edge off his appetite before gently pressing for details. "Danny, can you tell me how you ended up here alone?" The boy paused in his eating, his small hands wrapped around the warm bowl of soup. "My mom died 2 weeks ago," he said matter-of-factly, though Maggie could see the pain flickering behind his brave facade. "Oh, sweetheart," Maggie said softly. "I'm so sorry." Danny nodded, keeping his eyes fixed on his soup. She'd been sick for a long time. Cancer. The doctors said there wasn't anything else they could do. Maggie felt the familiar ache of loss, not just for this child, but for her own memories of sitting in hospital waiting rooms, holding Patrick's hand as the doctors delivered their own devastating news. "What about your father?" she asked gently. "Never knew him." Danny said with a shrug that was too casual, too practiced. "Mom said he left before I was born. Said some men just aren't built for staying." "And your aunt?" Danny's face brightened slightly. "Aunt Susie. She's my mom's sister. She lives somewhere in Wisconsin, I think. Mom always talked about her, but they haven't seen each other in years. Something about a fight they had when I was little. But your mother wanted you to go to her." "Yeah, before at the end, she told Mrs. Patterson, that's our neighbor, that I should go to Aunt Susie. Mrs. Patterson wrote down the address and gave me money for the train ticket." But then Danny's voice trailed off, and he reached into his pocket, pulling out a crumpled piece of paper that was barely readable. "I spilled water on it yesterday, and now I can't read most of it. I know it says Wisconsin, and I think the town starts with an M, but that's all I can make out." Maggie examined the paper, seeing the smeared ink and water damage. She could make out partial letters and words, but nothing that would help locate a specific person in a specific town. "What about Mrs. Patterson? Could she help?" Danny shook his head. "She moved to Florida to live with her daughter right after the funeral. She said she was sorry, but she couldn't take care of a kid. She's old and has her own problems, so you came to the train station. I figured if I went to Wisconsin and asked around, someone might know Aunt Susie. Mom always said we looked alike. Same red hair, same stubborn chin." Danny touched his own chin unconsciously. "But when I got here, there were so many different trains going to so many different places, and tickets cost more than I thought they would." Maggie's heart ached for this child who'd been forced to navigate an adult world with nothing but hope and determination. "How long have you been here?" 3 days, I think. Maybe 4. I've been sleeping in the waiting area, trying to look like I was waiting for someone. But I think the security guards are starting to notice." Maggie looked around the station, seeing it through new eyes. What had always seemed like a bustling, exciting place now felt vast and impersonal, full of potential dangers for a child alone. "Danny, have you thought about going to the police or social services? They could help you find your aunt." Fear flashed across Danny's face. "No. Mom made me promise never to go to social services. She said they'd put me in foster care. And foster care is, she said, bad things happen there. She made me swear I'd find Aunt Susie no matter what." Maggie understood the fear. She'd read enough news stories to know that the foster care system, while intended to help, could sometimes cause more trauma for children who'd already lost everything. "All right," she said gently. "No police, no social services. But you can't keep sleeping in the train station. It's not safe." Danny looked at her with those old, tired eyes. "I know, but I don't know what else to do." Maggie found herself at a crossroads she hadn't expected. Her train would leave in 20 minutes. She could give Danny some money, wish him luck, and return to her empty house with a clear conscience, knowing she'd done what she could. It would be the safe choice, the reasonable choice. Instead, she heard herself saying, "Come home with me tonight." Danny's eyes widened. "What? Come home with me?" Maggie repeated, surprised by her own words, but feeling the rightness of them deep in her bones. You need a safe place to sleep and real food to eat. I have both. Tomorrow, we can figure out how to find your Aunt Susie. But you don't even know me, Danny protested. I know enough, Maggie said firmly. I know you're a good boy who's trying to honor his mother's wishes. I know you're brave and resourceful. And I know that no child should have to sleep in a train station. Danny stared at her for a long moment, and Maggie could see him weighing his options. Trust a stranger or continue to fend for himself in a world that seemed determined to crush him. Why would you do that for me? He asked finally. Maggie thought about Patrick, about the children they'd never had, about the empty rooms in her house that echoed with the absence of family. Because maybe we can help each other, she said honestly, as they gathered Danny's belongings and headed for the platform. Maggie felt something stirring inside her that she'd thought was dead forever: purpose. For the first time in 3 years, she was looking forward to going home. The train to Elmhurst was nearly empty, and Danny pressed his face to the window as the lights of Chicago gave way to the quieter suburban landscape. Is your house big? He asked. Too big, Maggie admitted. It was meant for a family. But it's just been me for a while now. Did your family leave too? Maggie smiled sadly. My husband died 3 years ago. We never had children. Danny nodded solemnly. So we're both alone. I guess we are, Maggie said. But maybe not tonight. As the train carried them toward an uncertain future, Maggie found herself silently thanking Patrick for somehow guiding her to that bench where a little boy sat crying. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time since Patrick's death, she was curious to find out. Maggie's house in Elmhurst sat on a tree-lined street where most of the homes had been built in the 1940s for returning veterans and their growing families. It was a modest 2-story colonial with green shutters and a front porch that Patrick had always meant to repair, but never quite got around to. As they approached the front door, Maggie saw it through Danny's eyes: the overgrown garden, the newspapers piling up despite her regular trips to the city, the overall air of a house that was surviving rather than thriving. It's nice, Danny said politely, though Maggie could see him taking in every detail with the careful observation of a child who'd learned to assess new situations quickly. It needs work, Maggie admitted, fumbling with her keys. I haven't been very good at keeping up with things since my husband died. The interior of the house was clean, but felt frozen in time. Family photos lined the mantel, showing Maggie and Patrick through 35 years of marriage. Their wedding day, anniversaries, vacations, Christmas mornings. The furniture was well maintained, but showed its age, and there was a stillness to the air that spoke of a home where very little living had been happening. Danny stood in the entryway, his small bag clutched in his hands, looking around with wide eyes. It's really quiet, he observed. Yes, it is, Maggie said, suddenly hearing the silence through his ears. Are you hungry? I could make you something more substantial than that sandwich. I'm okay, Danny said automatically, then caught himself. Actually, yes, I'm still hungry. Maggie smiled. Good. Honest answers are always better. The kitchen was Maggie's favorite room, with yellow walls and white cabinets that Patrick had installed himself. She opened the refrigerator and realized, with embarrassment, how little food she actually kept in the house. Her own meals had become perfunctory affairs: toast for breakfast, a can of soup for lunch, maybe a frozen dinner in the evening. How about scrambled eggs and toast? She offered. I think I have some bacon in the freezer. That sounds amazing, Danny said, and Maggie realized he wasn't just being polite. When had she last cooked a real meal for someone who was actually hungry? As she moved around the kitchen, Danny perched on one of the bar stools at the counter, watching her every move. Can I help? He asked. Do you know how to cook? A little. Mom taught me some things before she got too sick. She said everyone should know how to feed themselves. Maggie handed him a whisk and the bowl of eggs. Your mother sounds like she was a smart woman. She was the smartest person I ever knew, Danny said, attacking the eggs with more enthusiasm than technique. She could fix anything: cars, appliances, even people sometimes. She was a nurse at the hospital before she got sick. Tell me about her, Maggie said, laying strips of bacon in the pan. As Danny talked, Maggie found herself building a picture of Sarah Mitchell, a single mother who'd worked double shifts to support her son, who'd taught him to be independent and strong, who'd faced her own death with courage and practical planning. It was clear that Danny had adored her, and equally clear that she'd raised him to be thoughtful and resilient. She used to sing when she cooked, Danny said wistfully. She wasn't very good at it, but she said music made everything taste better. What kind of songs? Old ones. Songs her mom used to sing to her. I don't remember all the words, but there was one about a mockingbird. Maggie felt tears prick her eyes. Hush, little baby. Don't say a word. Mama's gonna buy you a mockingbird. Danny's face lit up. Yes, that one. How did you know? My mother used to sing it to me too. Maggie said softly. Some songs get passed down through generations. They ate at the kitchen table, and Maggie was amazed by how different the house felt with another person in it. Danny ate with genuine appreciation, complimented the food, and asked questions about the framed photos on the kitchen windowsill. Is that your husband? He asked, pointing to a picture of Patrick in his garden. Yes, his name was Patrick. He loved growing things, vegetables, flowers, fruit trees. He always said the backyard was his cathedral. What happened to him? The directness of the question caught Maggie off guard, but she realized that a child who'd watched his mother die of cancer had probably moved beyond euphemisms about death. Heart attack, she said simply. Very sudden. He was working in the garden one morning, and I found him there when I came out with his coffee. Danny nodded solemnly. At least it didn't hurt. No, I don't think it did. That's good. Mom hurt a lot at the end, even with all the medicine. I used to wish, well, never mind. Maggie reached across the table and covered his small hand with hers. You used to wish it would be quick for her. Danny's eyes filled with tears, but he nodded. Is that bad? Wishing that? No, sweetheart. That's love. You wanted her suffering to end. There's nothing bad about that. After dinner, Maggie showed Danny to the guest room upstairs. It had been Patrick's office before his retirement, then briefly a craft room when Maggie had gone through a quilting phase, and finally just a storage space for things they couldn't bear to throw away but didn't know what to do with. I'll need to clear some of this out, Maggie said, looking at the boxes of Christmas decorations and old photo albums stacked on the bed. I can help, Danny offered. I'm good at organizing things. Together, they moved boxes to the hall closet and made up the bed with sheets that smelled of lavender from the linen closet. Danny insisted he didn't need much, just a place to sleep and maybe a lamp for reading. If he got scared in the night, do you get scared often? Maggie asked. Sometimes. Not of monsters or anything like that. Just of being alone, I guess. Of forgetting what my mom's voice sounded like or what it felt like when she hugged me. Maggie's heart ached for him. Would it help if I left my door open tonight? That way you'd know you're not alone. Danny considered this seriously. Yes, I think it would. As Maggie tucked him into bed, something she'd never done for any child. Danny looked up at her with those wise, sad eyes. Mrs. O'Brien, thank you for bringing me home with you. I know you didn't have to. Actually, Maggie said, smoothing the blanket around his shoulders, I think maybe I did have to. Sometimes people come into our lives exactly when we need them most. Like my mom always said about guardian angels, something like that. Maggie left the door open as promised and went to her own room, where she sat on the edge of the bed and looked around at the space she'd shared with Patrick. For so many years, for the first time since his death, the silence didn't feel oppressive. Instead, it felt expectant, as if the house itself was holding its breath to see what would happen next. Down the hall, she could hear Danny settling into sleep, and she realized that the sound of another person breathing in her house was the most comforting thing she'd experienced in 3 years. Tomorrow, they would start looking for Aunt Susie. But tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Maggie fell asleep feeling like she had a purpose beyond just surviving each day. Maggie woke to the sound of movement in the kitchen and, for a brief, heart-stopping moment, thought Patrick had come back. Then reality reasserted itself, and she remembered Danny. She'd brought home a lost little boy, and now he was in her kitchen doing God knows what. She pulled on her robe and hurried downstairs, expecting to find chaos instead. She found Danny standing at the stove, carefully tending what appeared to be scrambled eggs. The coffee maker was gurgling, the table was set for two, and he'd even found the good cloth napkins that Maggie rarely bothered with anymore. "Good morning," he said, looking up from the stove with a shy smile. "I hope it's okay that I started breakfast. I woke up early and didn't want to wake you up, but I was hungry, and I thought maybe you might be hungry too when you got up." Maggie stood in the doorway, overwhelmed by the simple domesticity of the scene. "Danny, you didn't have to. I wanted to," he said firmly. "Mom always said that when someone does something nice for you, you should try to do something nice back." The eggs were perfectly cooked, fluffy and seasoned just right. The coffee was strong but not bitter. As they ate, Maggie found herself marveling at this child who'd learned to be self-sufficient far too young, but who still remembered to be grateful and considerate. "So," she said, setting down her coffee cup, "today we start looking for Aunt Susie. Do you remember anything else about her? Where she works? What she looks like? Whether she's married?" Danny scrunched up his face in concentration. "Mom said she had red hair like mine, but curly. And she's younger than Mom was, maybe in her 30s. She works with computers, I think. Mom used to say Susie was always the smart one in the family." "What about her last name? Would it still be the same as your mother's?" "I don't know. Mom said there was a guy, Susie's boyfriend or husband maybe, but I don't remember his name." Maggie nodded, making mental notes. It wasn't much to go on, but it was a start. "After breakfast, we'll go to the library. They have computers there, and I bet Mrs. Chen, she's the librarian, could help us figure out how to search for people in Wisconsin." Danny's eyes lit up. "Really? You think we can find her?" "I think we can try," Maggie said carefully. She didn't want to promise more than she could deliver, but she also didn't want to crush the hope in his eyes. The Elmhurst Public Library was a Carnegie library built in 1918, with high ceilings, tall windows, and that particular smell of old books and floor wax that Maggie had loved since childhood. Mrs. Chen, the head librarian, had known Maggie for years through her volunteer work with the Friends of the Library. "Well, hello there, Maggie," Mrs. Chen said warmly. "And who's this young man?" "This is Danny," Maggie said, resting her hand on his shoulder. "He's staying with me for a while. We're trying to find his aunt in Wisconsin, and I was hoping you might be able to help us use the computers to search for her." Mrs. Chen, a practical woman in her 50s who'd raised for children of her own, took one look at Danny's serious face and Maggie's protective stance and asked no questions. "Beyond what was necessary to help, Wisconsin's a big state," she said, leading them to the computer terminals. "Do we have any idea what part?" "We think the town starts with M," Danny said hopefully. Mrs. Chen pulled up a map of Wisconsin and pointed to the screen. "Well, let's see. Madison's the capital. That starts with M. Then there's Milwaukee. That's the biggest city. Smaller places. There's Marshfield, Marnette, Menomonee." Danny studied the map intently. "Some of those sound familiar, maybe, but I'm not sure. Let's start with a general search," Mrs. Chen suggested. "What's your aunt's name?" "Susan Mitchell. Or maybe Susan something else if she got married." For the next 2 hours, they searched. Mrs. Chen showed them how to use various online directories, public records, and even social media sites. They found dozens of Susan Mitchells in Wisconsin, but without more specific information. It was impossible to know which one might be Danny's aunt. "This is harder than I thought it would be," Danny said, his shoulders sagging with disappointment. "Hey," Maggie said gently, "we've only been at this for one morning. These things take time." Mrs. Chen had been quietly working at another computer, and now she looked up with interest. "Danny, you said your aunt works with computers. Would she be in any professional directories?" They spent another hour searching through technology company websites, professional associations, and university staff directories. Finally, just as Danny was starting to fidget with discouragement, Mrs. Chen made a small sound of triumph. "Look at this," she said, pointing to her screen. Maggie and Danny crowded around to see a staff directory for the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Halfway down the list was a name, Susan Mitchell Torres. "Network Administrator, Torres," Maggie said thoughtfully. "That would explain why we weren't finding her under Mitchell. Danny stared at the screen, his eyes wide. Do you think that's her? There's one way to find out, Mrs. Chen said. There's a phone number listed here. Maggie felt her heart racing. They'd found a possible match. But now came the scary part, making contact and finding out if they'd found the right person. What do I say? Danny asked, looking suddenly very young and very frightened. You tell her who you are, Maggie said. You tell her about your mother, and you ask if she's willing to help. What if she doesn't want me? What if she hangs up? Maggie knelt down so she was at Danny's eye level. Then we'll figure out something else. But Danny, you can't live your whole life afraid of people saying no. Sometimes you have to take the risk. Mrs. Chen offered to let them use the phone in her office for privacy. Maggie dialed the number, her hands trembling slightly, then handed the phone to Danny, University of Wisconsin. Computer Services, this is Susan. Danny's eyes went wide, and for a moment Maggie thought he was going to hang up. Then he took a deep breath and spoke. Hi, my name is Danny Mitchell. I'm looking for my Aunt Susie. My mom was Sarah Mitchell, and she died 2 weeks ago. And she told me to find you, but I lost your address, and I've been looking everywhere. The words came out in a rush, and then Danny fell silent, waiting. Maggie held her breath, watching Danny's face for any clue about what was happening on the other end of the line. Mom's sister Susie, Danny said, his voice rising with excitement, with the red curly hair. Yes, that's you. Then his face crumpled, and tears started streaming down his cheeks. But he was smiling too, and Maggie realized they were tears. Of relief, not sadness. I'm in Illinois, Danny said, with a lady named Mrs. O'Brien who's been helping me. We found you on the computer at the library. Maggie watched as Danny listened to whatever his aunt was saying, nodding and wiping his eyes and occasionally making small sounds of agreement. Finally, he held the phone out to Maggie. She wants to talk to you. Maggie took the phone with trembling hands. Hello, Mrs. O'Brien. This is Susan Torres. I can't thank you enough for helping Danny find me. I had no idea that Sarah had died. We hadn't spoken in years. Family stupidity, you know how it is. I'm just glad we found you, Maggie said. I want to come get him right away. I can leave work and drive down there today. Where exactly are you? Maggie gave her the address and directions, and they arranged for Susan to arrive that evening. As she hung up the phone, Maggie felt a complex mix of emotions, relief that Danny would be reunited with family, but also a strange sense of loss at the thought of him leaving. She's coming to get me, Danny said, his face shining with happiness. She said she's always wondered about me, and she's sorry she and Mom fought, and she wants to hear everything about what Mom was like. That's wonderful, sweetheart, Maggie said, and meant it, even as her heart gave a little twist, as they walked home from the library. Danny chattering excitedly about meeting his aunt. Maggie found herself thinking about how quiet the house would be again tomorrow. She'd had Danny for less than 24 hours, but already the thought of returning to her solitary existence felt unbearable. But this was what they'd been working toward, she reminded herself. Danny needed to be with family, with someone who could give him the stability and love he deserved. Her job had been to help him find that, and she'd succeeded. So why did success feel so much like loss? Susan Torres arrived at 6 o'clock sharp, driving a blue Honda Civic with Wisconsin plates and a car seat hastily installed in the back. She was exactly as Danny had described, red curly hair, now streaked with early gray, and the same stubborn chin that Danny had inherited. But what struck Maggie most was the resemblance around the eyes. Danny had gotten his mother's coloring, but his aunt's kind, intelligent gaze. Danny, Susan called out as she got out of the car, her voice uncertain. Danny burst through the front door and stopped short on the porch, suddenly shy. Susan climbed the steps slowly, her own eyes filling with tears as she took in her nephew's appearance. Oh my God, she whispered. You look just like Sarah did at your age. Except for the hair, that's definitely Mitchell red. Are you really my Aunt Susie? Danny asked, his voice small. I really am, Susan said, kneeling down to his level. And I am so sorry about your mom. And I'm sorry it took losing her for us to find each other. Then Danny was in her arms, hugging her fiercely. and Susan was crying and laughing at the same time. Maggie watched from the doorway, feeling like an intruder on this private family moment, but unable to look away from the joy on Danny's face. "Mrs. O'Brien," Susan said, standing and wiping her eyes, "I don't know how to thank you. When Danny told me you found him crying in a train station and brought him home with you, I mean, what you did was, anyone would have done the same thing," Maggie said, though she knew it wasn't true. "No," Susan said firmly, "they wouldn't have. Most people would have called security or social services. You took a scared little boy home and helped him find his family. That's extraordinary." They went inside, and Maggie made coffee while Susan and Danny sat at the kitchen table, catching up on 8 years of separation. Susan explained that she and Sarah had had a fight when Danny was born. Something stupid about Susan not being supportive enough during the pregnancy, about judgment and misunderstandings that had seemed insurmountable at the time. "I wrote letters," Susan said, her voice thick with regret, "dozens of them. But I never sent them. I kept thinking I should wait until I could say the right thing, until I could fix what was broken between us. And then years went by, and it seemed too late. Mom kept your picture," Danny said quietly, "on her dresser. She used to look at it sometimes when she thought I wasn't watching." Susan started crying again, and Maggie quietly refilled coffee cups and tried to give them space for their reunion. But as the evening wore on, something began to feel wrong. Susan seemed genuinely happy to see Danny, but there was also a tension in her voice, a hesitation that Maggie couldn't quite identify. Finally, when Danny went upstairs to pack his few belongings, Susan turned to Maggie with a troubled expression. "Mrs. O'Brien, I need to be honest with you. I want Danny more than anything. He's the only family I have left, but I'm not sure I can take care of him properly." Maggie set down her coffee cup. "What do you mean?" "I work 60-hour weeks. I live in a studio apartment near campus. I don't know anything about raising children. I've never even babysat. And Danny's been through so much trauma. You'll learn," Maggie said. "People figure out how to be parents every day. But what if I screw it up? What if I'm not what he needs?" Susan's voice was rising with panic. "I'm 34 years old. I've never been married, never wanted kids. I love my career. I love my independence. Taking Danny means giving up everything I've built for myself." Maggie felt a chill of recognition. She was hearing the same doubts that had plagued her and Patrick for years. The fear that they weren't parent material, that they didn't know enough, weren't ready enough, weren't selfless enough to raise a child properly. By the time they'd worked through those fears, it had been too late. "Susan," she said carefully, "are you having second thoughts about taking Danny?" Susan buried her face in her hands. "I'm a terrible person. I drive all the way down here. I make him believe everything's going to be okay, and now I'm sitting here wondering if I'm making a huge mistake." "You're not a terrible person," Maggie said firmly. "You're someone who's being honest about a life-changing decision. That's actually pretty brave. But what choice do I have? He's my nephew. He has nowhere else to go." "There are always choices," Maggie said quietly. "Maybe not easy ones, but there are always choices." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to Danny moving around upstairs. Finally, Susan looked up at Maggie with an expression of desperate hope. "He's happy here, isn't he? I can see it in his face. He feels safe with you." Maggie nodded, not trusting her voice. "What if," Susan began, then stopped. "No, that's